David Carter had always prided himself on being a good father. He had raised his son, Ethan, alone for many years after his wife passed away. Their home in suburban Ohio was modest but comfortable, and David worked long hours at the office to make sure they never lacked anything. Ethan had always been responsible, careful, and respectful, a son any parent could be proud of. That's why when Ethan returned home after a difficult breakup, David welcomed him back without question. He assumed that his son needed time too, heal space to figure himself out, and a familiar environment to regain his balance. But over the past few weeks, something had shifted in the way Ethan carried himself. There was a tension in his demeanor, a nervous energy that David could feel but could not fully explain. On that quiet Thursday evening, David came home exhausted from work. The house was unusually silent, a little too quiet for the hour. Normally, Ethan would be sprawled on the sofa playing video games, or at least making some noise in his room. But tonight, the house felt empty, almost unnaturally calm. David set his briefcase down and noticed the soft sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. He paused, unsure if it was Ethan or someone else. The sound was deliberate, careful, almost like someone trying not to be noticed. A chill ran down his spine, though he tried to brush it off. Perhaps it was nothing. Ethan had been home more frequently late at night, and he often stayed up talking to friends online. That could explain it, but as David approached the staircase, he heard something that made him stop cold. A whisper. Then another whisper, quieter, almost conspiratorial. And then, unmistakably, a soft laugh. David's heart started to pound. He had raised his son well, and David trusted him completely. But something about the tone of that laughter set off alarm bells in his mind. Fathers had instincts, he reminded himself. Something wasn't right. David tried to reason with himself, telling himself he might be overreacting. Maybe Ethan was just talking to a friend on a late call. Maybe he had someone visiting. Still, the voice he heard didn't sound like any of Ethan's friends. It was feminine. The subtle timbre of it, the nervous laugh, the careful pauses, belonged to a woman. David froze mid-step, every nerve alert. He wasn't sure whether to confront Ethan immediately or to gather more information first. Curiosity gnawed at him, and before he could stop himself, he slowly climbed the stairs. Each step creaked softly under his weight. The hallway light was dim, throwing shadows across the floor. When he reached the top, he noticed Ethan's door was slightly ajar. From the small opening, he could see movement inside, shadows shifting, subtle gestures that made his chest tighten. He knocked gently on the door, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ethan, everything okay?" There was an instant silence, followed by hurried footsteps inside. Then Ethan's voice came, shaky and defensive. "Dad? Is that you?" "Yes," David said, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "I just wanted to check in." There was a pause. Then Ethan appeared at the doorway, pale and nervous, his eyes avoiding direct contact. "It's just a friend," Ethan stammered. David's brow furrowed. "A friend at 10:30 at night? Whispering in your bedroom?" he asked, keeping his voice even but tinged with suspicion. Ethan couldn't answer immediately. David stepped closer, glancing past his son, and that's when he saw her. Emily Parker, David's neighbor. She had been married for almost 15 years, and her family had been friends with David's for over a decade. They celebrated holidays together, barbecued in each other's backyards, and shared countless happy memories. Seeing her standing nervously in Ethan's room made David feel as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. Emily's eyes were downcast, embarrassed, avoiding his gaze completely. Ethan shifted, trying to block her from view. "Dad, it's not what you think," Ethan said, his voice defensive but weak. David let out a quiet laugh, not of amusement, but of disbelief. "Really?" he asked slowly. "'Cause what it looks like is your son secretly meeting a married woman in his bedroom. In our house, the weight of it pressed down on him." His mind raced, trying to process the impossible. Why would Emily, a married woman and a friend's wife, be here? Why would Ethan and his son be complicit? And why in their own home, where anyone could walk in at any moment? Ethan swallowed hard, his face pale. Dad, I didn't mean for you to find out like this. David's disappointment was sharp and immediate. He had always believed in honesty, trust, and integrity. And yet, here he was, confronted with a betrayal that was both emotional and moral. Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. It's not Ethan's fault. David looked at her sharply. Then whose fault is it? Eh? Demanded, the frustration creeping into his tone. Neither of them answered, leaving the room thick with unspoken truths. David's heart was heavy. He realized that this was not a one-time mistake, not a fleeting moment of poor judgment. Something deeper, longer term, was happening, something that involved betrayal, secrecy, and emotions that were far too complicated to untangle in a single conversation. David took a deep breath and tried to steady his mind. His immediate thought was to protect Ethan, to shield him from the consequences of this shocking secret. But another part of him, the part that valued honesty and loyalty, knew that Mark Emily's husband and David's close friend deserved to know. He felt torn, trapped between protecting his son and upholding moral responsibility. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and he realized that there was no easy path forward. David's thoughts swirled with questions. How long had this been going on? Was this just a fleeting attraction, or had something more developed over time? And most importantly, what would the consequences be for everyone involved? His mind flashed to Mark's face, to the countless moments of trust and friendship that would now be shattered if the truth came out. He couldn't imagine confronting his friend with this knowledge, yet staying silent felt like complicity in something that could destroy lives. Ethan's nervous energy filled the room as he tried to explain himself. Dad, I didn't plan for this, it just happened. David's voice was calm but firm. That's what everyone says when they get caught, son. You can't just shrug it off. Ethan looked down, guilt and fear evident in his eyes. You don't understand, it's complicated. David leaned back, listening as Ethan struggled to form his explanation. What is so complicated that it justifies sneaking around? Ethan hesitated, then spoke quietly. Her marriage, it's broken. She's unhappy. I didn't know what else to do. David's eyes narrowed. Unhappiness is not a free pass to betray your family, certainly not mine or Mark's. Emily finally spoke up, her voice quivering. I wanted to feel alive again. I felt invisible in my own life, ignored and lonely. When I met Ethan, he listened, he cared, and it was comforting. David felt a pang of empathy, even as his disappointment lingered. He understood loneliness, he had lived through it. But the situation still felt morally wrong, painfully wrong, and potentially destructive. The room was heavy with unspoken truths, the kind that leave a mark on hearts and minds. Ethan spoke again, softer this time, almost pleading. Dad, I tried to stop it. I really did. But we just couldn't. David's chest tightened as he watched his son, the young man he had raised with love and care, standing there on the edge of a moral abyss. He realized that he couldn't simply judge Ethan as a child anymore. He was a young adult, making choices, with real consequences. And yet, the bond between father and son made it impossible to turn away entirely. Finally, David took a deep breath, gathering the pieces of his thoughts. He had to think. He had to process the shock, the betrayal, the moral complexity, and the emotional turmoil all at once. This was no ordinary conflict. It was a collision of love, desire, guilt, and human weakness, playing out in the most intimate of spaces, the home. David sat down slowly, trying to calm his racing mind. He knew that the coming days would be filled with hard conversations, difficult decisions, and emotional turbulence that could shake the foundation of his family and his friendships. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The secret had been exposed, and the fragile balance of trust had been shattered in an instant, in that quiet room. With Ethan and Emily standing before him, David realized that the path forward would require courage, clarity, and perhaps forgiveness. But for now, all he could do was absorb the shock, confront the reality of what he had found, and prepare for the storm that was surely coming. Because the truth had been revealed, and the consequences, emotional, relational, and moral, were only just beginning. And as David looked at his son and the woman who had crossed the line between friendship and infidelity, he knew that the night had only just begun. The questions, the revelations, and the emotional reckoning were far from over. The journey of understanding, of navigating complex human emotions, and of facing the unexpected realities of love and betrayal had only just started. And David braced himself for what was to come, knowing that nothing in his life or Ethan's life would ever be quite the same again. David Carter didn't sleep that night. The images of his son and Emily standing together in his house replayed over and over in his mind. He had sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at a cup of cold coffee, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Ethan had returned home after his breakup, seeking comfort, and instead of finding it in himself or in healthy friendships, he had entangled himself in a situation that could destroy multiple lives. David rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He wasn't just a father now. He was a man who had uncovered a web of secrecy, betrayal, and emotional confusion that involved people he cared about deeply. Finally, after a long pause, Ethan spoke. "Dad, please say something." His voice trembled, desperate for guidance, forgiveness, or at least understanding. David looked at him carefully. Ethan wasn't the little boy who had once clutched his hand walking to school. He was a young man who had made choices with consequences. "What exactly do you want me to say?" David asked calmly, though a sharp edge hid beneath his tone. Ethan hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said finally, the words spilling out in a rush. It happened." David took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "That's what everyone says when they get caught," he replied quietly. The room fell silent. Ethan's guilt was palpable, and for a moment David felt a pang of sympathy for the boy he had raised. But sympathy didn't erase the reality of the situation. David's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the feelings of love for his son with the sense of betrayal that cut deep. He wanted to scream, to confront, to demand explanations, but he also knew that anger would not get to the truth. He had to understand before he could act. Ethan swallowed hard, finally speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. Her marriage is complicated." David frowned, the frustration evident in his eyes. "Complicated? Ethan, we're talking about my friend Mark. Complicated doesn't justify sneaking around. Complicated doesn't justify betrayal." Ethan looked down, ashamed, knowing that words alone could never erase what had been done. "I know, Dad. I know it's wrong. But you don't understand the way she's been treated. I didn't know how to help her otherwise." David leaned back, listening as his son tried to explain. "Mark, he's been your friend for 20 years. He trusted us. He trusted you. You're talking about loyalty, family, friendship, and you've thrown all of it into the air for comfort?" Ethan flinched under the weight of his father's disappointment. David's voice softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. "I am not saying feelings aren't real. I am saying actions have consequences." Before Ethan could respond, a quiet voice interrupted the tension. Emily had returned, her eyes red and glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe I should explain," she said softly, her words heavy with regret. David turned to look at her, startled by her courage. She stepped into the kitchen, slowly, carefully, as though walking on fragile glass. The room grew tense again, every heartbeat loud in the quiet. Emily spoke, her voice trembling. "Oh, my marriage. It's been broken for years. Mark has become distant, cold. There's no laughter, no affection, no warmth. I've been invisible in my own life." Her gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet David's eyes. "Then one evening, I ran into Ethan while walking my dog. We talked, just talked about life, about feeling lonely, about wanting to feel seen again. And then it happened." David's mind reeled. This explained the emotional connection, the whispers, the laughter, the comfort, but it didn't make the act right. "You're telling me that a broken marriage justifies sneaking into someone else's home, betraying a friend, and lying to everyone?" he asked, voice tight but controlled. Emily shook her head. "No, it doesn't justify it. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I wanted to feel alive again, wanted to feel like someone noticed me." Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Dad, I tried to stop it. I really did. But we couldn't. We didn't plan for this, and once we were in it, it became complicated." He looked at his father pleadingly, his eyes full of desperation and remorse. David leaned against the counter, letting the silence stretch for a moment. He realized that Ethan's remorse was genuine. His son had not intended to create chaos, but intent didn't erase consequences. The kitchen was heavy with unspoken truths. David's thoughts raced as he tried to process the chain of events. A lonely married woman seeking attention. A young man offering emotional comfort. A friendship. Betrayed. A family potentially destroyed. He thought of Mark, his longtime friend, the countless barbecues, shared laughs, holidays, and trust. How would he ever face Mark after this? Could he? Should he? And what about Ethan? Could he ever fully understand the consequences of his actions? David took a deep breath and let his eyes travel between Ethan and Emily. "You both need to understand something," Key said slowly, deliberately. They looked up at him, bracing themselves. "What you're doing will eventually destroy more than just one marriage. It may destroy friendships, families, the people who trust you." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, guilt and fear etched in every line of his face. "Are you going to tell Mark?" he asked almost too quietly to hear. David didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, as if the air itself had thickened. Telling Mark would be devastating, a rupture that might never heal. But staying silent could feel like complicity, as though he condoned the betrayal. And in the middle of it all, he had to protect his son from the full force of what might happen. Finally, David spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I am not going to make that decision tonight. But this cannot continue." Emily exhaled slowly, relief mixed with sadness. She knew he was right. Their connection, whatever comfort it had brought, could not last without causing immense damage. Ethan nodded silently, understanding the gravity of his father's words. They had reached a turning point. The secret was out, but the future remained uncertain. The choices they made next would determine the fate of multiple lives. David felt the weight of responsibility like a heavy cloak. He had to navigate the emotional minefield before him, balancing loyalty, morality, compassion, and truth. The night stretched on, long and silent, as the three of them sat together, processing the enormity of what had been revealed. In that stillness, one truth became clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The bond of friendship, the trust of family, and the innocence of relationships had all been fractured, leaving behind a delicate landscape of raw emotion and uncertainty. As the hours passed, David realized that this situation demanded more than immediate judgment. that required understanding, empathy, and careful navigation. He could not ignore the emotional reality of loneliness and connection that had led Emily and Ethan to this point. But he also could not ignore the moral implications. He had to guide his son, protect him from making further mistakes, and consider the consequences for everyone involved. Ethan broke the silence again, voice soft, almost a whisper. "Dad, what do we do now?" David considered this carefully. "We stop this. We take responsibility for our actions, and we figure out how to move forward without hurting anyone else. But it starts tonight. No more secrets. No more late night meetings. You both need to understand the seriousness of this." Emily nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I understand," she said softly. David stood, walking to the window and looking out at the quiet street. The night was still peaceful on the surface, but beneath it lay a storm of emotions, decisions and consequences that would unfold in the coming days. He felt a mixture of sorrow, anger, compassion, and resolve. There were no easy solutions. Here, no simple ways to repair the fractures that had formed. But acknowledgement, honesty, and courage were the first steps toward facing the reality of the situation. Finally, he turned back to Ethan and Emily. "You need to realize," he said quietly, "that sometimes love appears in the wrong place, at the wrong time with the wrong people. And when it does, no one walks away without scars." The words hung in the room, heavy and undeniable. Emily wiped her eyes. Ethan looked down, and David felt the weight of his role in what would follow. He had to act as a guide, a protector, and a moral anchor. Even as he wrestled with his own emotions, the night ended with an uneasy silence. The secret had been revealed. The emotional truths had been exposed. But the real consequences, emotional, relational, and moral, were only beginning. David knew that in the coming days, the bonds between friends, the trust of family, and the integrity of relationships would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. And as the three of them sat together, connected by a shared secret, David understood one thing clearly. This was not just a story about infidelity. It was a story about loneliness, longing, human vulnerability, and the complexity of emotions. It was about the choices people make when they are desperate for connection. And it was about the courage required to face the consequences of those choices, no matter how painful they might be.